Good afternoon, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to our first public webinar of the year at Caabu. A very happy new year. I hope you are all safe in these grim and rather troubled times, and that all your families are as well. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome today Anders Persson. He's going to be talking to us about the subject of his book, the details that we'll put out there, EU diplomacy and the Israeli-Arab conflict between 1967 to 2019. And I know, of course, the obvious question is that Britain is now and has been formally outside of the EU for nearly a year. But during this period, of course, since the UK was part of the European community after 1973, it's had a major influence on British policy, and our existing policies right now reflect, that time. They're very much policies developed under the auspices of the European Union. How long that remains to be the case, who knows? But it's really hard to see right now that the UK will drift far away from the EU position. So I think that it's an excellent opportunity to review all those decades of EU policy making and see what lessons can be learnt going forward. And Anders Persson is a fantastic person to guide us through this. He's a political scientist at Linnaeus University in Sweden, specializing in EU Israel-Palestine relations. And of course, Sweden recognized the state of Palestine, and that was one of the first European Union countries to do so. Certainly in recent times, many of the Eastern European countries, of course, recognized during the era of the Cold War. So he's widely published, he's appeared on many media outlets on this issue, and he's going to speak on the record. And we're going to have a discussion first and then open it up to Q&A. So Anders, thank you very much for being with us today. I wanted to start really with a general question about the EC and the EU over this period. It's often been portrayed as the sleeping giant in this conflict, subordinate in some sort of way to the United States that has been the supreme arbiter, mediator between the two sides, that the EU has forked out so much funds, put so much energy into that, but has not been prepared to actually seek a more political role. So could you sort of take us through that, just why does the EU seem to so many to be almost impotent politically on this conflict?
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. And well, I mean, there are a number of ways to answer that question. I mean, one can sort of answer it in a positive light and say, well, compare the EU to, say, other actors involved there. That would be the US, Russia, the Arab League, perhaps individual Arab states, maybe China, maybe the UN, maybe even Israel and the governments of Palestine. And if you compare the EU to other actors, it will come out in a quite good light because it has been more consistent than the others. It has upholded international law, I would say more than many others. And of course, there are tremendous failures for the EU here in the conflict. But I mean, it's not that the US can, talk about that many successes. And I think America's responsibility is far, far greater, and even their problems, I would say. But having said all of this, of course, the EU has had enormous problems. First of all, in translating its economic leverage into political leverage. That's sort of one of the big conclusions. And of course, it has had tremendous difficulties of moving sort of from A to B, even if they sort of know where the end of the tunnel is, a two-state solution in the view of the EU. It has had tremendous problems of sort of implementing its vision and even to get change on the ground. And of course, I would say, and there are competing theories about why this is the case. It's, the one theory would say it's because of the structure of the EU, another would say it's because of, the Holocaust and the legacy of that, and a third theory would say it's because of the Americans, and so on. I believe that the inability of the EU to move forward is to, I would say, 80% depending on the role of America. One can play with the idea that, let's say that Biden now, or Trump before him, or Obama before him, would have put in all American leverage to get Israel out of the occupied territories. Had they done that, they would of course had 100% backup from the European Union, including all the member countries, and nobody would say that the Holocaust is too sensitive in Germany to move forward on this, or there wouldn't be any right-wing crackpots in Eastern Europe stopping that. So this is sort of an overview of how to answer your questions from different perspectives.
Your book is really a very detailed, almost forensic analysis of every statement, almost going back to 67. It's extraordinary. You must have spent a long time going through the bulletin and press releases and statements by all sorts of EU actors. I mean, how, looking back to 1967, and it just struck me, the little expectation we had of European community statements in those days, even, to recognize Palestinians. I mean, broadly, how have you seen EU policy and positions developing?
Oh, they have been developed tremendously, and they have also had an impact. I mean, EU diplomats believe sort of in the power of discourses, and remember that the Trump administration also did that, and they spent a lot of time changing these international parameters, which to a large extent are European parameters, or at least sort of created by Europe in the first place. So if we go back to, say, the early 1970s, and we can take the Palestinian here as a case study, in the EU's first statement on the conflict from 1971, they talked about Palestinians as refugees. You couldn't mention the term Palestinian. It was so sensitive back then. Remember, Golda Meir said that there weren't any Palestinians. So the EU went from talking about Palestinians as refugees in 1971, using the name Palestinians in 73, this is after the oil crisis, talking about Palestinians as having legitimate rights, also in 1973, then talking about Palestinians as having legal rights, the right to a homeland, the Palestinians as being a people, and finally in 1980, the Palestinians having the right to self-determination. Now, this is not unlike how Europe once spoke about the Zionist movement before Israel was created. And of course, when all of these things happened in the 1970s, the EU was severely criticized, primarily by Israel, but also by the Americans and by the Palestinians. But we see, of course, as the decade went through, that many other actors adopted these positions themselves. Now, this continued into the 1980s when the EU advocated for the Palestinians and other Arabs to recognize Israel, which the Palestinians did in 1988, for having an international conference on the conflict, which happened in Madrid in 1991. And the EU also early on legitimized the two key principles of Oslo, which were mutual recognition and land for peace. So all of these ideas materialize with the peace process in Oslo. Now, of course, if we move forward to today, we see that a lot of these parameters have been rolled back, especially the land for peace formula, which has been replaced now by an American and Israeli peace for peace formula. We'll see what happens with that when Biden takes over. But sort of one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the EU has had tremendous normative power in the conflict. Now, this is not necessarily something positive. It was used to delegitimize Hamas in the 2006 election. So the idea to place the political wing of Hamas on a terror list was taken on the very symbolic date of September 11, 2003, 2.5 years before the Palestinians placed the same group in their governments. And we know we have seen 3 wars in Gaza since, and an absolutely devastating humanitarian situation. And the EU has contributed to that. So normative power doesn't have to mean anything positive. And we see, of course, that the development on the ground is stronger than the EU's normative power. We also see that the EU is no longer sort of driving the discourse here. If we look at the present discourse, the leading academics, the leading think tanks, they talk a lot about apartheid, forced transfer, forced eviction, one-state solution, and EU is very far from all of these discussions.
Indeed, and if we have a look at some of the motivations behind European positions, I mean, one thing that struck me and reminded me really very strongly was the issue of oil. 1973 seemed to certainly push forward EU activity on this. But nowadays, arguably, we see less focus on this position. How have you seen the motivations? You know, what makes European Union typically so interested in this conflict and at times less so?
Well, it has shifted during the decades. If we go back to 1967, we see that, for example, right after the war in 1967, the EU back then, it was of course only 6 members and then Britain and others joined, but the original 6 members depended on 80% of their oil consumption, almost 50% of their total power supply from oil from the OPEC countries. So this was a major strategic factor for European involvement, and also for what I call sort of the pro-Palestinian tilt after 1973. Now, when the 1973 war happened, price of oil went up 4 times, and that led to massive transfers of wealth from Europe, from America, from Asia to the OPEC countries of the Middle East. Now that in turn led to a massive increase in trade, with over 1,000% trade increase in the 1970s between the EU and the OPEC countries, and thereby in the process creating another strategic objective. And then you can also say, you can go back even further to right after the war in 1967 and say that this conflict was used to foster integration within the EU. It was used to create the EU's foreign policy from the beginning. So this conflict has been there from the very, very beginning. It's very central to the EU's identity. And then as the decades went by, it became a very central part of what was called the war on terrorism within quotation marks. But the EU, in its security strategy from 2003, said that this is a strategic priority for Europe, and resolving this conflict will lead to a lot of other good developments in the region. This is what I call the EU's twin narrative, that this is the key conflict, and solving that will lead to other good developments. And there are also many people that, for example, connect other conflicts. They say, all conflicts from, say, the civil war in Lebanon to the Palestine conflict to the outbreak of the war in Syria in 2011. So it is also central for understanding other conflicts, even if it's not the only factor behind everything. And it has also been symbolic. It has tremendous symbolism from the First World War, the era of colonialism, Second World War, the Holocaust, the Cold War, the rivalry between the superpowers, the war on terrorism, and now, of course, with the new identity politics, both from the far left, Black Lives Matters in the US, to the far right here in Europe and elsewhere. So these are some of the reasons behind the European involvement. And also keep in mind that the EU for many decades saw this conflict as a direct security threat to Europe.
Thank you. Just to remind everybody, if you have any questions for Anders, if you could put them in the chat, and I shall try and call you and we'll have a good discussion. I just wanted to go on to one of the central planks of European Union policy, the support for a two-state solution, really, from the Venice Declaration onwards, in the way in which it become a sort of sacred part of EU foreign policy. I mean, do you see any weakening in this? I mean, you mentioned earlier on, numbers of people looking at alternative, solutions to this conflict at one state or federal system, etc. Do you still think that a two-state solution is going to remain as this sort of core part of the EU position?
It's a good question, and there are sort of several ways to unpack it. First of all, if you speak with EU officials, they will say that, you know what, international law is not something that you can cherry pick from, depending on, the latest fashion of the day. So they believe that the two-state solution is sort of firmly anchored in international law, and it's possible to change that. A one-state solution would be consistent with international law if both Israelis and Palestinians would approve of that. The problem, of course, is that they don't. First of all, the Israeli government, I cannot see on the horizon ever that they would accept a one-state solution, at least not in the form of, one person, one vote in historic Palestine. There are sort of Israeli one-state solution where the Palestinians have no votes, or sort of versions of that, but that's another story. And of course, it's the same with the PA. I mean, as long as the PA support a two-state solution, I have a hard time seeing the EU not doing that. And Hamas isn't really, in favor of any other viable alternative as far as I can see. And also, I mean, even if polls show that the support for the two-state solution, both among Israelis and Palestinians, are lower than what has been before, and perhaps the lowest it has ever been, especially the lowest in 10 years or so. It depends how far back you go. But I mean, I checked the latest figures today on the Palestinian side, and the two-state solution is polling around 40%, which is, again, is the lowest in 10 years. If you look at Khaled Shikaki's polling, which I think is the best, but a one-state solution was polling at 29% or so. So the one-state solution doesn't have support among the Palestinian people, as far as I could see. It has a lot of support among Palestinian academics and intellectuals and sort of other think tank people, but not among the populations, as far as I could see.
Another plank, particularly, since the start of this century, perhaps, has been the focus of the EU on state building, and trying to build up the institutions of a Palestinian state. You said that this was, I think, in your book at one point, quite a risky approach. How do you evaluate that? One goes back to the days of Salam Fayyad when he was prime minister, and he was very much associated with that. Do you think that's something that the EU regrets, perhaps?
Again, both yes or no. I mean, it was, of course, a bet of, investing billions of euros in a project with a very sort of uncertain future. And the bet was, of course, that hopefully, eventually, sometimes down the line, a Palestinian state would be established. And if that would happen, the EU would be widely credited for, having been so persistent and having supported this all the way, back to the early 1990s and even, further back. So, but I mean, again, you can make a positive or a negative analysis of this. And the positive would be that if you go back 10 years to the Fayyad era, the EU was sort of the main actor in preparing the PA in the West Bank for statehood. And they achieved that technically, because all the leading actors, the World Bank, the IMF, the EU itself, the UN, and others, declared that the Palestinians were technically ready for statehood, that Palestinian institutions in the West Bank performed above the threshold for what was expected of a functioning state. And many EU officials, they would say that the Palestinians function as a state, say, far better than the average state in the world. So, and if you look at the typical Palestinian city, they say like Nablus or Hebron or Ramallah, they would compare, I think, favorably to many, cities in the region, in Jordan or in Lebanon, and better than, of course, in Egypt and Syria by far. So in light of this, it has been a technical success, I would say, but of course a great political failure, because the EU itself was not ready to recognize Palestine when push come to shove in 2011 and in 2012 as well in the UN, first in the Security Council and then in the General Assembly. There are tremendous problems, of course, with the state building approach, especially, having a Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, who was the super darling of the West. He got 1% in the Palestinian elections of 2006. So there were major democratic problems. But still, I think we should keep in mind that in the state building literature, the argument is very clear that building state is difficult, it is violent, it takes time, it is often authoritarian, and you will reap the rewards further down the line. And I think it can happen. I'm not excluding that a Palestinian state will come into being. The question is, what kind of state? And the negative analysis would be, of course, that the EU has pumped in around 15 billion euros or so, which is huge if you look at it per capita. It has not been able to transform the reality on the ground. It has not been able to stop the settlements. It has not been able to pressure Israel to end the occupation. So there are all these kind of problems, and a lot of Palestinians are unhappy about it. Even if we should be honest and say that stopping the funds will also be a very, very risky move, because if we have learned anything from the Middle East over the past 20 years, I would say that the collapse of governance structures in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, and elsewhere has been absolutely catastrophic. And in light of that, it is very difficult to see anyone in Europe wanting to collapse either the governance structures in Gaza or in the West Bank. And we see, of course, that Israel is upholding these structures. We see it very clearly with the help to Hamas from Qatar, and there are many other examples of that. A final point to make here is that it's also interesting to see that both pro-Palestinian activists and pro-Israeli activists agree that the funds to the Palestinian Authority that is wrong. So that's one of the few things that they actually agree about. And it is in Caabu and the people sitting in office that are supporting this. So that will be my final point here.
Just before I turn to the participants, what about individual states and what role they've played in all of this? Up to Brexit, of course, one would have thought Britain, France, and Germany, is to what extent the European Union is going to miss in any way British foreign policy expertise on this issue. I think that's one question. And also, I think a lot of people will say, has Germany been the country that weighed down EU policy from being more supportive of the Palestinians? And then finally, and you mentioned authoritarianism, there now seems to be this pretty massive breach, really, within the European Union between largely Western European Union states who are prepared to stand up on international law on this issue and others, and Eastern European states like Hungary, the Czech Republic, etc., that have no interest in this at all, Poland. And, we saw extraordinary things, I think even last year where, Hungary prevented a common statement, etc. I mean, are we deluded in thinking that the European Union is going to be able to come up with some strong common position in the future because of these rifts?
Well, many good questions here. If I unpack them one by one, I think it's fair to say that traditionally, France has pushed the EU to engage and often taken a pro-Palestinian side. At least they have wanted to be engaged and push for all kinds of things. Whereas Germany has been more reluctant, of course, very carefully not to upset the Israelis too much. Whereas Britain has been the bridge between the EU and the United States, often wanting to have the United States involved. And then, of course, it could shift depending on the government in these three countries. But as you say, that it's absolutely correct to say that the EU has never been more divided on this issue than right now, or at least before Biden comes into office. So Trump has also contributed significantly to widening the European member states on this issue. But still, it's also clear that the divides go far back to before Trump, and this authoritarianism that we see in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe has also benefited Israel greatly. Israel has developed strategic alliances with several of these countries, primarily with Hungary, and that alliance has stopped the EU from issuing Foreign Affairs Council conclusions for the past 5 years on this conflict. So Israel has together with Hungary, effectively blocked sort of the EU's united voice here. So we see, for example, that when EU comes with statements now, it's often from Borrell or a foreign policy spokesperson. It's not from the EU Council itself. And Israel has developed many other strategic relations with Poland, with Lithuania, Cyprus, and many other countries. So people often talk about that the Palestinians are the ones getting more and more recognition from Europe, whereas in reality, it is the Israelis.
Right, I think, thank you for that. I think we'll start off with some questions. And I'm going to go first of all to Sir Robert Atkins, who I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was a member of the European Parliament and took a strong interest in this issue for many years. Sir Robert.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, thank you to Anders for coming along, and congratulations to Caabu for setting Israel up. It's very difficult to know where to start. For 15 years, I was a member of the European Parliament and a member of the European EP Palestine group, and went on several occasions to Gaza and Palestine and so on. The problem we had, and you touched on it, and it's a comment as much as a question. What do we do about the difficulties between the PLO and Hamas? Because if you go to Gaza, it's Hamas. If you go to anywhere else, it's the PLO, and never the twain will agree. And therefore, no matter how hard you bang their heads together, it doesn't work. Secondly, I remember attending a meeting of our Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, in which there were 17 senators from the States, all of whom hadn't got the foggiest idea about Palestine or Arab issues, and who were obsessed with Jerusalem and the Israelis. And as long as that obtains, one can't get anywhere. Thirdly, really, and finally, a good friend of mine, Alistair Burt, was a first-rate Foreign Office minister and who tried to bring some common sense to bear, and was outmaneuvered, if you like, because of the pressure from the States about the UK's position. So those three areas, if none other, are the ones that cause most despair. What, if anything, can we do about it, given that the EU just doesn't have a spine, because it won't stand up to the States? I mean, at one point, for example, our group was banned from talking to Hamas, even though we'd gone to Gaza to talk to Hamas. Yeah. I mean, that's how lily-livered they were. How can we overcome this and try and get some measure of common sense and backbone in resolving these difficulties?
Thanks for great questions, Sir Robert. And I mean, start with the Hamas and Fatah split. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the EU has contributed to it, and I think the way forward is elections somehow, because it will give the Palestinians at least an opportunity if they proceed with elections, and that is a big question mark. But at least it will give sort of legitimacy to the Palestinian project somehow, and in the best of worlds, it will revitalize the Palestinian movement. But I mean, I fear strongly that Palestinian elections will not produce a concrete result. And I mean, and that the split is so deep that it's unbridgeable. I mean, is it possible to vote away, for example, Hamas weapons in Gaza? I don't think so. Will the Fatah party and Abbas, accept a defeat? I don't think so. I simply can't see the Fatah party as an opposition party. And they don't regard themselves as such. They regard themselves as sort of, like the nation state. And if you want to be part of the sort of democratic process, you should join the PLO. That's how they see it. They don't see anyone outside the PLO as legitimate. So I have a hard time seeing anyone concede here. I mean, of course, Donald Trump behaved, like the way he did, but I think both Hamas and Fatah will not accept a defeat. And remember, of course, that Fatah didn't do it last time around, in 2006. But apart from that, apart from supporting elections, having European monitors there, and all of that, it's hard to see what the Europeans can do from the outside, because I mean we have been in this situation so many times where outside parties want something in the Middle East so much more than the people themselves. Now, we should of course say that the Palestinian people in all polls are very strongly in favor of reconciliation. But how to do that practically, it's very difficult. And also these two parties represent so different worldviews on anything from, say, religion to school books to all kinds of daily life. So it's very difficult to see them in a sort of unity government as well. So that is a huge issue. But of course, we need to be in favor of elections, because that's the way we handle these kind of things, and that people will have, the chance to vote and have their say, and that may, revitalize all kinds, and also create a dynamic that we may not know where it will end. But I am strongly in favor of elections myself, and I really hope that they will take place. And it will also, I think, be easier for the Europeans to engage with the Palestinians the more democratic they are, because they have been losing a lot of public support over the past 15 years because of the democratic deficit. If we go back to the sort of the question of how difficult it is to pressure Israel, and I would say that it's very clear in the EU literature that I have reviewed that sort of pressuring Israel is the strongest taboo there is in EU's foreign policy. So it is just plain to say that. And that has to do with a lot of different things. It has to do with the relations with America. I think that's the primary cause. It has, of course, to do with the pro-Israeli lobby, which is much stronger in the US than in Europe, but it is still here. And it also has to do with all kinds of institutional features. The fact that this has been going on so long, people are afraid to challenging these kind of structures. So there are all of these things involved as well. But having said all of these things, I think it's fair to say that when Israel is pressured, and it has happened on a few occasions, it often works. So if people have sort of the courage or spine to pressure Israel, they often get quite good results out of that. So that is important. You take, for example, the settlement guidelines that the EU instituted in 2013. They were considered a bombshell in Israel, and many other actors followed. So it is possible to do things. For example, when Sweden recognized Palestine in 2014, it was seen as a very, very brave act by the Swedish government. There was a hope that other countries would follow. And unfortunately, they didn't do it. But it has been rumored so many times that other European countries would follow, but they haven't done that. And also, I think that in this way, if Trump would have won a second period, I think that would have led to a deep rethinking in Europe of how we should approach this conflict on all levels. Now, when Biden won, I think it's sort of back to a sort of false status quo where everybody can relax a little bit and just take a wait and see approach while nothing is happening. So that may actually be bad in that sense that a second Trump period would have produced more radical thinking in the European Union, I think, but it's very difficult to say because nobody has any clue what Biden will do here. That it is a truth. Everybody, of course, take it for granted that he will focus on Iran first and not on Palestine, but also it's important to remember that Israel and Palestine, they have a tendency to sort of bite back when you least expect it. And it also sort of comes in through many other channels, like, for example, the IRA definition, which I think will be the main issue for freedom of expression in Europe and in the US over the coming decade. So, and that is, of course, directly connected to the conflict. So there are sort of it will affect our societies in various ways, even if we won't focus explicitly on solving this conflict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. And just as if you could respond to this very shortly, do you think the EU would be ready to work with a government that included Hamas or even led by Hamas now? Do you think that they would have changed their position since 2006?
Well, the EU has said that they are in favor of free and fair and inclusive elections, but it remains to be seen. I think they will take a softer approach if Hamas wins, or if they are part of a government somehow, or if they, which they have a good chance of winning. That's important to point that out. They are polling almost, the polling I think is around 40% and Fatah at 44%. So and Haniya is polling ahead of Abbas in the presidential election. So they are in a quite strong position, I would say. And then it remains to be seen if Bavruti and others will run. They may that may alter, but Hamas is in a strong position. And keep in mind that 2/3 of the Palestinians want Abbas to resign. So he is in a very weak position. He has been so for a long time. And the same is true for his Fatah party.
Right. We have a couple of questions which I'm going to take now because we're on the issue of elections on this subject. So Kafir Mazur, I don't know if I pronounced your name, Kafir.
Yes, you did.
You have a question.
You did. Hi, Anders. Thank you so much for this talk. It's nice to see you again. It's a fantastic book that you have. This is a question that I've often been asking myself. How do you account for this sudden realization of the EU that there have been no elections among Palestinians for over 15 years now? How come they didn't remember this, say, in 2012 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 or 17? Why do you think it all of a sudden dropped on us, like out of nowhere?
Well, I would say first of all that Abbas and Hamas have promised elections many times before, but never really held them. And it remains to be seen now if they will take place or not. And many people believe that they won't take place. So that's very important to emphasize that, especially if Fatah is polling really bad, then they might not take place. And the same, of course, is true for Hamas in Gaza. I think also that there has been a fear in both in the EU and in the US and elsewhere, that if you go back, say, 10 years to the Arab Spring, which broke out, and then we had all the trouble in Syria, we had the rise of ISIS, we have had the problems with Iran, and all kinds of problems in the Middle East over the past 10 years. I think there has been a fear that if elections were sort of pushed forward in the Palestinian territories, and if they would lead to, say, either an inconclusive result, or further violence, or destabilization, or other kinds of trouble, that wasn't really what people wanted. So in light of that, and in light of the risks of holding them and the risks after them, I think these are sort of some of the concerns for why people haven't pushed stronger for them. And of course, we are back to this, that outside parties want something more than the locals, which we have seen how difficult that is in the Middle East and elsewhere.
I thought of a different theory, but
yeah, but go ahead and challenge me if you.
No,
what is your theory?
I'm sorry. I'll make it real quick. I just figured that for the past few years, Mahmoud Abbas has been banging on the European door to take some sort of action, and the Europeans have been very reluctant to do so. And it's sort of Merkel's way, for example, of saying, get your affairs in order first before you come to us, knowing he won't follow through with the elections. And that would kind of like be her way of saying, before you come and talk to us and ask us for anything, get elections in order, hoping and knowing that he won't do it.
Yeah, but he still gets his money. I mean, the EU will fund the PA with or without elections. So I mean,
safe comfort zone. Safe comfort zone for all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
Sorry.
Thank you. We had one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kafir. Now we had just a very quick question to follow up on that. Of course, we have Israeli elections coming up. How do you see that affecting things?
It's very interesting, and there is, of course, a possibility, and people have been talking about this possibility for some time now, that all of the three sort of main leaders involved there will be gone in a not so distant future. Now Trump is gone. Abbas is 85. I don't think that he will outlast Biden if he wins. And of course, people have been saying for many times that the Netanyahu era is over or soon to be over, and he has proven us wrong all the time. Now he seems to be challenged mainly from the right, from Gideon Saar, who seems to be the main opposition candidate, and Bennett, who seems to be the kingmaker, without whom it won't be possible to form a government. So he seems to be challenged mainly from the right. And again, even here in Israel, all the polls show that there isn't a clear governing coalition after the election, if things stand as they do today. Now, of course, a lot of things may change. There is, of course, a big, a big thing to watch, whether sort of the vaccine, and Israel is leading the world here in vaccinating its population, whether that will be something that Netanyahu can use, and he will do, of course, the best as he can to do that, or of sort of the economic problems of the COVID pandemic will sort of outweigh that. And it will again be an election for and against Netanyahu, as we have seen over the past 2 years. And it seems to be, it looks like it will be a tight race, and Netanyahu is sort of very famous for fighting over every vote. And the most interesting aspect of the Israeli election so far is that he has been reaching out to one of the Arab parties, one of the parties in the Joint Arab List, which is an Islamic party, sort of, ideologically rooted with the Muslim Brotherhood. So, if anyone would like to speak about an unholy alliance and a crazy coalition, you have it there. The interesting thing, of course, here is that the Arab parties are being legitimized and are sort of being more and more part of the political landscape in Israel than they have been before. And they seems to be closer to power as well than what they have been before. So these are some of the things that are worth watching in the Israeli election. But it will be an interesting year for sure here with Biden and 2 elections coming up.
Indeed. Now we have a question on a different matter from David Powell. Are you still with us, David?
Yes, I am. Yes. Hi. Sorry, I'll go video. Yeah, Anders, thanks for that. I just wanted to pick up on a point you made about the US change of policy. As far as I know, Biden hasn't said he's going to pull back from what you call the peace for peace policy rather than land for peace. I just wonder what's going to be the reaction in Europe, or has there been any reaction in Europe to this? And are they going to follow that as the way forward, or do they regard further normalization between Arab states and Israel as a good thing that will ultimately help the Palestinians, or do they take more the official Palestinian line that this is actually problematic for Palestinian rights? So it's really the political direction.
Yeah, thanks for a great question. No, of course, Biden has said that he will that's one of the few foreign policy initiatives of the Trump administration, that he will follow somehow the normalization agreements between Israel and the Arab states. Well, I think if we go back sort of and look at this from a theoretical point of view, there has always been sort of 2 big approaches to Middle Eastern peacemaking. And the first is called the inside-out approach, meaning Israeli-Palestinian peace first, Israeli-Arab normalization later. And the other is the outside-in approach, meaning Israeli-Arab normalization and peace first, and Israeli-Palestinian peace later. The EU and the PA have, of course, always supported the first line here, whereas Israel and the US have traditionally supported, or not always the US, but the Trump administration and the Israeli government supported the second approach here. The big fear, of course, in Europe is that there won't be Israeli-Palestinian peace later here after the normalization agreements. There are a few points I think worth making here. And again, you can analyze this from sort of a negative point of view and a positive point of view. And I start with a negative point of view here, that Egypt and Jordan today are more authoritarian than they were when they signed their peace agreements with Israel in 1979 and 1994, respectively. And Israel is, of course, upholding these authoritarian structures when they say, well, let Mubarak stay, save Mubarak. And now they are telling Biden, go soft on, human rights issues in the Gulf. So there is an issue here, what I call the authoritarian peace. And you see, for example, that in many of these countries, in Sudan, 80% are against the peace normalization with Israel. Same figures in Morocco. It seems to be more positive in the Gulf countries. But of course, even today, dissidents in Dubai and in UAE and Bahrain, are thrown into prison when they oppose normalization with Israel, and they are sort of being surveilled today by Israeli spy technology. So this is there is a fear, I think, that the normalization agreements will lead to more authoritarianism in the region. I think that's a real fear, especially based on the historical record. So that is sort of the negative view, the negative take here. The positive take would be that peace is being valued again in Israel for the first time in a very long time. We also see that, I think that it's fair to say that sort of normalization and peace with Israel is part of these countries' modernization efforts, which I think is something positive. It also seems like they are taking on, anti-Semitism seriously, or more serious than before. Seems to be, welcoming Israeli tourists, and they seem to be, cleaning up textbooks and these kind of things. So that is, of course, very positive, and I welcome that. And the EU is also welcoming these agreements, even if they take a little bit of a wait and see approach. And there are, of course, also other issues involved there, say, Trump, all kinds of transactional deals where, we see, for example, a militarization of the Middle East now with, big weapon sales. One can, of course, think of that if that is a good thing. One of course, also see the problems with, say, international law recognizing Western Sahara. And in these agreements, if you read the text, there are very little emphasis on, say, democracy, human rights, multilateralism, women's rights, all these kind of things. So these normalization agreements, they look very different from, say, a typical European normalization agreement with a new state like Kosovo, for example, where you have democracy, human rights, multilateralism, all of these kind of things. So we see an authoritarian peace at the moment, but will it change in the future? Difficult to say. But again, the truth here is that nobody knows where these agreements will stand in 20 years. But will these countries be able to leverage Israel to make concessions against the Palestinians? It doesn't look like that at the moment, but it may change. I am in favor of them, and I have no problem saying that, but I say it with caution, and I think it's important sort of to point out the problems involved there, and they are severe. But that would be sort of my answer.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right, now we've got a question from Martin Butcher. Martin?
No. All the unmutey stuff, and sorry about taking the time there. Yeah, it's actually that your last response prompted another question, which I'll do first, and then I'll come back to the other one. I'm interested that you look at the normalization agreements as actually intended to be peace agreements. I look at these things through security policy, disarmament, non-proliferation lens. And to me, they look like nothing more than a way of building an alliance between Israel and Gulf states to wage war in Iran. And really nothing very much to do with peace in Israel-Palestine. So that was just interesting. My other question was, I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the way in which you say that the EU has fallen off the pace of debate about the evolving situation in Israel and Palestine, and particularly the use of the term apartheid. And we're having a big debate in Oxfam at the moment about how far to push the use of that term, and whether it's helpful even with relations with the EU and that kind of thing. So that was my question anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Martin. I mean, I use sort of both the terms normalization and peace agreements, and the reason for that is that the agreement with UAE was officially called a peace agreement, whereas many of the others are called normalization agreements. That's where I use sort of both of the terms simultaneously. But you are of course right that this is this is sort of an anti-Iranian coalition and an alliance, and with all the weapon sales going in, it's one of the big problems I think with it, and it remains to be seen what will come out of this. Still, I think that there is sort of more to it than just sort of the anti-Iranian part, because trade and all these kind of things seems to be real. The anti-Semitism, the fight against that also seems to be real. So there is, I mean, I think change going on here, not necessarily connected to the Iranian issue. And then going back to sort of the discourse again, as I said, for a long time, the EU sort of led and pushed discourse on this conflict, and that has stopped now. And the EU is, is very, very afraid of sort of touching terms like apartheid, annexation, colonialism, all of these kind of terms that dominate the debate right now. And the funny thing here is that, as I put out in the book, in the 1980s, the EU talked about the West Bank settlements, by using terms like colonization and annexation when they were a fraction of what they are today. And the same, of course, is true with Biden when he was in Israel the first time. So that is important. When it comes to the sort of the term apartheid, it's a huge discussion. And there are arguments for and against. What I can say, sort of from a personal point of view and from a Swedish point of view, is that Sweden was sort of one of the countries who early on supported both the PLO and the ANC in South Africa. And a lot of sort of the people who are working, sort of the senior people who are working with the Palestinians today, are the same people who worked with Nelson Mandela in the 1980s. And I can say that most of them would not use the term apartheid to describe the situation, which may be, be perceived as a little bit strange, given that, we have the B'Tselem report this week, and we have many other people talking about it. And there's also sort of, I think, a distinction to be made. If people follow sort of the legal definition of apartheid, I think it's easier to make the case and connect it to Israel. But if one sort of studies sort of the South African society, I think it's much harder to make that case. So that is sort of because South Africa, to me, and I went there last year before COVID and sort of did my own sort of field trip and did my own research because I wanted to learn what apartheid was. And for me, it is a lot about sort of skin color, black and white. And to me, that argument doesn't work in Israel-Palestine. First of all, because Jews come in all colors. This is Amos Oz famous argument. And also, I mean, if you want to sort of push the race argument and the sort of skin color argument really far, many of the Israeli soldiers who are stationed in the West Bank are Mizrahi, meaning Jews from the Middle East. Whereas Palestinians are often seen as a sort of a lighter, they have quite light skin, many of them. So many of the Israeli soldiers actually have a darker skin than the Palestinians. So in light and in light of that, I think it's kind of strange to sort of push the apartheid analogy. But that is sort of only my opinions. And there are also sort of the whole issue around apartheid. It's being discussed a lot at the moment. But there are also other people, say there are other African intellectuals, I've forgotten the name, who sort of who try to compare it more sort of with traditional colonialism rather than with a specific part of just apartheid. But it is a huge issue. It is an issue that will sort of be with us for the foreseeable future. But it's and it is a difficult issue, I would say, and to deal with.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Jose Vericat, indeed one of our former Caabu interns. Jose, it's been a long time. Are you there?
Let me just unmute myself. Hi, Chris.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Very good to participate in this, and wonderful really to hear Anders. I wanted to. I've moved on from Caabu, and I'm now at the European Institute of Peace as a senior advisor. working primarily on Israel and Palestine, and I've just finished 3 years as the Carter Center representative in Israel-Palestine, based in Jerusalem, Ramallah. So I just wanted to push a little bit more on the issue of elections and that very cautious optimism of yours, saying that the EU might actually respond a little bit more positively. If I may add a little bit of my own analysis, I do think that I take note of Khalil Shikaki's polls, but I do think that, push comes to shove, Palestinians have learned their lessons from what's been happening over the years since the last 2006 elections. And I really think, they're not going to vote so massively for Hamas, but that's inevitably a phenomenological, very limited sort of conclusion based on, just my everyday experiences and contact, etc., extensive as they have been. I know that others are in disagreement with me. Amira Hass, for example, who just recently published an article, she's, I think, more pessimistic than I am in that particular respect. But regardless, I also think that there are, Hamas itself might not participate, might not field candidates. I know that, I've had very regular contact with the group when I was there, and talked about this very issue extensively. And I know that they hadn't reached the final decision, and there's this sort of very strong internal discussion on the subject. So. But still, so I think there's room for optimism if you think that the EU would be able to respond more positively or more flexibly on this. And I wonder why, on what grounds you think that is, given that it's so internally divided, as you have said, and there are so much internal opposition as well. I also wanted to ask you about the lack of a common EU policy now, the lack of sort of the conclusions that are being blocked year after year by the more hostile countries, and the way that the new High Representative Josep Borrell has been switched slightly the approach and taking more of a sort of more protagonism, more of an individual initiative. And how you see that moving ahead. Also, people talk about the group of like-minded countries in the EU that that would act independently. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose.
Well, thank you, Jose. And there are a couple of questions to unpack there. I think, if we go back to 2006, I think it's clear that we should see this period sort of in the light of what I've said before, in the sort of war on terrorism, quote unquote, period, where a lot of the decisions were taken with that background of terror attacks in Europe, the 9/11 and the Second Intifada, all of that. I think today, 15 years later, a lot of people would say candidly that placing the political branch of Hamas on a terror list was perhaps not such a good idea, because it isolated first of all, it isolated Gaza with all the consequences that had. It also isolated the Europeans. And it's kind of quite ridiculous to see everybody talk with Hamas. You see Israel talking with them all the time. You have Russia talking with them. You have Turkey talking with them. Even the Americans under Donald Trump were talking with them and try to invite them into there. Basically, everybody is talking with Hamas except for the Europeans. And I think that is a ridiculous situation. But having said that, and I said, I think today many believe that it was a mistake to do the kind of the things the EU did vis-a-vis Hamas. But let's say that Hamas wins both the legislative elections and the presidential election. It will, of course, be very difficult with the EU to engage with an actor which is so fundamentally opposed to everything that the EU stands for. There really is zero appetite in the EU for militant Islamism. There is zero appetite for that. So it will be very difficult. So exactly what will happen, I don't know. And I don't think that the Europeans know that either. And it's, we have to wait and see. So it is a difficult issue really to do. What was the second part of Jose's question? I forgot it now. Jose, what was the second part of your question?
the question about Josep Borrell's more active
Yeah,
role
exactly. Thanks for it.
as
Yeah, I mean,
individual voice separate
yes.
from.
Of course, I mean, the question here is what mandate does he has when he talk? And it's difficult to answer that, but of course it's a much weaker mandate than had all the 27 member states taken, you know, a common position. And that of course is true when you have, say, 5 or 8 like-minded countries condemning settlements or demolition and these kind of things. So a smaller European voice here is of course a much weaker European voice. That would be my conclusion there. And it's as I see today, it's hard to see whether the EU will have a common voice in the future. If Biden push for that, I think there is a great chance it will happen. But if he doesn't, I think it will be harder.
Anders, we've got several questions, and I'm going to, because we're running out of time, just summarize a few of them. Firstly, why the European Union hasn't really been able to have a successful approach on settlements that really pushes back and stops the Israelis from expanding them, and why, for example, there has been no ban on trade with settlement products, and we've seen some moves in various member states, including, for example, Ireland. So any thoughts on that? And also a question as to what extent, you know, just in what way does this conflict in any way threaten EU security? I mean, Arthur Goodman asks, you know, does it provoke terror attacks? So perhaps we could just address those 2 points briefly. That would be great.
Yeah, I start with the with the first question of settlements. Of the final status issues in this question, that's Jerusalem, borders, refugees, security, and settlements, the EU see the settlements as the most important of these final status issues because the settlements is the vehicle for taking over the land. So for that reason, it is the most important of the final status issues. And the EU has not been able sort of to prevent the massive expansion of settlements. You could say that the Europeans have had perhaps a voice here and there, and that the situation could be worse on the ground had it not been for European protests and all these kind of things. Maybe Israel would have built in, you know, E1, Givat Hamatos, raised more communities and these kind of things. Maybe, we don't know, but maybe. I think there's an argument to be made for that. Also, the EU started to take up sort of small steps against the settlements. We had the settlement guidelines and labels and all these kind of things in 2013, 15, and these kind of that may have, you know, continued further had Donald Trump not won in 2016. If you speak to EU officials, they often say that sort of banning settlement products would be sort of a step further down the line. That it may have been some things that would have happened if Israel had annexed the parts of the West Bank, which they talked about doing last year. This whole differentiation strategy of separating the international recognized Israel within 1967 borders from the occupied territories is what I think, or it was sort of designed to be a strategy to deal with Israel legitimately if the occupation will continue for the foreseeable future. That was at least the thinking before Trump came into being. We'll see now what will happen with Biden. The second question here, I forgot it again. Sorry, my memory is. It was, Chris, remind me.
It was about security and whether.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this region, Israel-Palestine, is much closer to Europe than it is to America and Russia and China. So there is a geographical argument to be made. The war in 67 was seen, and even more in 1973, when both of the superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, talked about sort of, you know, using nuclear weapons and stuff. It was seen as very, very destabilizing to Europe, even if it sort of was over quite fast. You take the first Lebanon war of 1982. This is the war that sort of led to massive refugee flows to Europe. So it had a direct impact. I think it's also fair, one can also make an argument that a lot of Islamic terrorism has been connected to this conflict. If you go back and read bin Laden's statements, for example, Palestine has a very central place there. the guy who planned the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he said, according to the 9/11 Commission report, that he planned those attacks because he wanted to do that for the Palestinians against Israel. So Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, featured very heavily in Al-Qaeda's narrative, much less so in ISIS narrative, even if the ringleader of the Paris attack said that they were going to be the ones who were going to liberate Palestine. But it was a big issue for Al-Qaeda and much less so for ISIS. And if we see Al-Qaeda as sort of, Islamic terrorism 1.0 and ISIS as 2.0, it remains to be seen what, the next wave will bring. But it has been a very central feature of Islamic terrorism. There is no doubt about it.
Thank you very much. We've run over time a little bit, so I'm afraid I can't get through all the questions. There are a lot of them today. So thank you everybody on the call for all your questions and for attending today. And of course, a huge thank you to Anders for speaking to us today, for writing a book. It's a terrific resource. I do advise you. And if you go to the website, there is a 30% discount if you use that code, if you wish to get it, I think from Edinburgh University Press. And of course, just to say a little appeal, those of you who are Caabu members, thank you very much. But those who haven't joined, please do so. All the details are on our website. It would be great to have you on board. We need your support to keep these events and webinars going, as well as all the rest of our work. It's a tough time to raise funds. So anything you can do on that front would be gratefully received and appreciated. In the meantime, thank you everyone, and stay safe, and look forward to seeing you at future Caabu events.